really pleased to start the third part of our afternoon by welcoming Lucy Neal, who those of you who caught the very beginning of today will know that we've been traveling in the same direction for some time, and Lucy has been inspiring me through that time and has only recently caught up with the degree to which she's been inspiring me by seeing that I use a quote from her Playing for Time book, or their Playing for Time book, because it's a multi-headed endeavour. And Charlotte, who's here today, thank you, Charlotte, for making your way down from East Anglia, edited, and Julia, and I think it's not only Julia, forgive me.
I'm Julia Ramsbury and Hilary Jones.
Yes, who are all part of this book that was launched in 2015. And I think that it is a very creaturely book, and I'd like to think that Lucy would say that we were playing for time. So without much more introduction, because I think you're going to do a whole lot of that, aren't you? I'm going to hand over and hope that we have got people back online and ready. And if you can't see or hear, please just unmute yourself and shout, because otherwise it might be a sadly wasted opportunity to be sharing across worlds. Please.
Thank you, Anne, and hello everybody in our space online. I'm Lucy Neal, and I'm genuinely humbled to have been invited by Anne and Lara to join the Preachers session this afternoon. I have a theatre background, and I have long been fascinated, therefore, in story and how things happen and what the dramaturgy is of change, and how we kind of journey, how we make stories, but also how often the story ends up making us. And a question I asked myself a good 10 years ago was, having got very involved in grassroots activism. I live in Tooting, Hilary Jennings lives there close by. But when I first, having seen the kind of films that people mention, like the Al Gore Inconvenient Truth, I gave myself time to really reflect on how are we living and how do we make change in how we live, where we live. And these things began to preoccupy me very much in terms of a creative practice. And so the book that we are talking about, and I'm happy to talk about it this afternoon, is called Playing for Time, Making Art as If the World Mattered. And in a way, although it does involve 60 remarkable artists, practitioners, designers, makers, creators, celebrants, storytellers, activists of every form that you can imagine, it came originally from a question I was asking myself, which is, when we consider our story on the planet today, is what role do our imaginations play in addressing and looking at those challenges, but also our creative capacity. And I couldn't find an immediate answer to all that. And within the transition movement, of which I was part, I had set up with Hilary and others, Transition Town Tooting, all the play, all the experimentation, all the questions we were asking at a local area. And I've been completely won over by the treaty, the Finsbury Park Treaty, about being in public spaces, being where people live, being in the common place where people gather and encounter and share the values of their life. How does change come into that? How does the story and the narratives of our lives? So Playing for Time set out to try to answer that question. I was never going to write a book like that on my own. It was going to be a handbook. It was going to hopefully place into people's hands a practice, or different people's answer to that question about how do you work imaginatively with your creative capacities, intentionally, to address the challenges that we face. And the journey of the book took several years. It was a collaborative one. Charlotte Buchan joined me as my collaborator-in-chief, as the editor of the book, and Hilary and Maria and Julia were part of a core group of about 15 people that I invited, some of whom I knew well, some of whom I had not met before, to, in a sense, kind of throw down the structure of the book, to say, well, what is the arc of the narrative that this book is trying to find and to tell. But the book was published in 2015, which is now 7 years ago, by Oberon, and it was Oberon then got took over by Bloomsbury, and the book is now sold out, which is a little bit heartbreaking because I get quite regular messages from people saying, "I'd like to get your book," and I can't. And so it is a decision that has been made very recently with help from Creatures and Anne and her collaborators to reprint the book with Triarchy Press. And it's not to rewrite the book, but I hope enlisted your help this afternoon in a very short sort of miniature version of how we actually put the original book together, which was to combine our own imaginations and responsibilities and creative responses to the times that we're living in, to validate the idea that we can put down for our own purposes and for other people who can then gravitate and find themselves not alone. And I think that in the last 7 years, one of the main things that has come to me in the purchase and the reading of the book is that people again and again and again have responded to the heart and the spirit of the story being told here, that they have a role to play and they have their own way in terms of how they define that role, but actually this gives them something of a home, because the stories in the book are not falling into the silos of our conventional arts of opera or visual arts or performance or photography or dance. They are landing with care. I call this an aesthetics of care. So they're landing with land or home or water or hand or body or word or street. Things that sort of are of the essence of creative practice that is in service to life, ultimately. So what we were just going, Charlotte and I were just going to ask you to do a little bit of talking to each other about reflecting on the last 7 years of your lives, or the last 7 years of your own practices, but also the last 7 years of the earth, of Pachamama, of our home, the place we belong, the place we're living on and with. And in order to, in a sense, validate for me and for Charlotte and brothers, the purpose of reprinting the book and making it available again to others who would wish to have it. And before we do that, I would just say one thing about some of the narratives that emerge, and I have so much sort of resonance with what you have all been talking about in terms of Creatures has been achieving over the last 3 years. But in order to know what the projects that the book was going to include, and it's a practical book in the sense that it's setting out to be a handbook. So whilst there are many artists and activists whose stories are in it, including my friends that are here today, in order to shape the parameters of the narratives that were being told, we found 4 narratives, and I'll just sketch them out loosely because in terms of your looking back over the last 7 years, it would be very helpful for you to kind of bear these in mind. So the first narrative was the sort of the Gaian narrative, the story of the earth, our home, which is a sort of super narrative, which is one of life, an abundance of life, but of course it's also in a sense of home. It's one that's so perilous and threatened and frightening for us and so difficult to look at sort of as on our own. The second one is what we call the sort of grand narrative, which is the sort of story of action, or it's the story of intervention, or it's the story of response, and the sort of dramatic one about how we are, you know, the circuit breakers and how we intervene and create change. Then the third narrative, which in essence is the story of the book and it's the story of our lives, which is what is the shared narrative? What is the one of community? What is the one of the communal narrative and the collaborative and connected one? And in a sense, that is the narrative that helps us look at the other two, but it also galvanizes and energizes. And then the fourth one that's utterly critical for any practitioner in this is what is our own narrative? What is our personal narrative? The biographical one, the one that we have our own practice and we walk a line every day along that practice in terms of how we evolve it and how we develop it. And that's who we are. That's our heart. That's our heart knowledge. That's how we apply who we are, how we act in this world. So those 4 narratives just helped us shape the parameters of the book. So Charlotte has. Did you want to come in, Charlotte? And I know. What do you want me to say? But I think that what would be useful for you to say, Charlotte, is because Charlotte is the editor and one of the directors of the Dark Mountain Project, which some of you may be very, very familiar. She's a very extraordinary writer in, herself and an editor. But this idea of books and the life that a book has for 7 years. It's sold out. Why would you go back and start reprinting it and start them all over again? And I think in terms of the sort of dropping a plumb line down through time, the feedback that we've had, but also why that feedback helped us cast forward to the next 7 years.
Right. Okay. Am I supposed to be addressing the owl? Or both?
I think, if you wouldn't mind, people say they can hear okay, but if you should hear, then you could address the owl and the room.
Oh,
Would that be all right?
Yeah. I'm taking my note. Well, I know I'm not going to use it, but here we go.
I think like
Is that good?
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Al.
I'm also in 2 time zones. That's really bizarre.
Yeah. Because the owl, the owl's stripping up the head.
I won't take
But no, look, it's adjusting.
Okay.
Well done, Al.
Well, then I feel I had such a great performance. Somebody once said to me, actually, the reason that human beings are not really aligned with the planet is that the planet's always improvising. And that the real way to engage is to improvise and not have a perfect script. So, hey, let's do it now. Let's do the show right now. Okay. So I was really embedded in the transition movement. I mean, do people kind of know what the transition movement is? Yep. And Lucy and I were invited to help create a book by Rob Hopkins. That wasn't just by Rob Hopkins. It was about all the people involved in it. Anyway, we met over a table and we both kind of eyed each other up and started to talk about Joseph Beuys, as one does in the cafe in Totnes. And there was a spark that went on. Lucy said, I want to do a book. And I said, oh, I might give you a hand. Oh, anyway, we started a conversation. But I think it was very, most people say your relationship for your life is cemented in the first 15 minutes you make a meeting, whether it's a land, a person, an animal, or whatever. And so Joseph Beuys was our bridge, if you like. And Joseph Beuys is really interesting. You probably all know his work because he's terribly famous. But he had this idea of social sculpture, which is that if you create a certain kind of environment, people will talk differently. They will be held differently. So he did this one called Honey Pump in the Workplace, where honey was pumped all the way around the exhibition space, and people would meet and talk about all kinds of deep subjects about life, about the ecology, about what was going down. And for me, when listening to you about creative practice, it's all about creating those warm spaces. Because if it's cold and hard and, we want facts and, we're all interested in the economy, we're never going to create anything different. So that's where we met, about creating a warm space. And I think bees must have been in it somewhere. I can't remember. Were you starting off a high at that point? Because what I was speaking with Lucy, there are 2 things. One is that to capture what we're all going through is really an ensemble work. It's a collaborative work. And yet we live in a culture that's completely linear. That's the individual, the hero goes out and gets things and then he comes back, and it's always usually is a he. How are we going to tell the story collaboratively as a collective? And many of the creative projects that are arising in response to all the catastrophes that are going on are necessarily collaborative. But how do you do that in a book? Well, you need a big book for a start, a very big book, or like we do in Dark Mountain, we produce 2 books a year that are all collaboratively made and include 60 to 70 different artists and writers each time. But this is a whole different practice. And what I found with two things with creating these books is that you have to work very differently as an editor. Because you are collaborating and you're pulling in and you're making sense of, but also what you know why you're doing it in these particular times, because living in a linear culture, it never gives back. So as an artist, as a writer, as a participant, as a creative practitioner, within that is this feedback loop that makes this, you go out, you gather all your stuff, and then you bring it back. And this really is the figure of 8 that the honeybees make when they return and bring pollen and nectar back to the hive. So with that very different principle, you are embarking on a very different kind of creative practice. And what I'm always saying to, well, I said it to people in transition who were not actually that keen on artists. If you're an artist or writer, it's like, yeah, write a press release, or you can design a poster because you're an artist. You know what I mean? It's like, no, it's really fundamental to change. That creativity is the bridge. Art is the bridge. Writing is the bridge, mostly also into the imagination. The bridge to the non-human, to the medicine, because that's what artists and writers have always done through time. They are that. So this feedback loop, I feel, is one of the most important things that artists and writers can do. And when Lucy's talking about, you know, we're going to be looking at this timeline, the big events, but also which are kind of all kind of shaped in a linear way. And underneath here are all the creative projects like this mycelial network. And you're not trying to do what everybody says you should be doing, which is evangelizing and getting them to change. Because you don't ever get them to change. You actually have to transform your own being and inspire and compel people to do that, to undergo that change. And artists and writers, when they meet up, know each other and they just strengthen the network. Hardly what we're doing here. You know, we're two disparate projects, but we're meeting because we're all connecting in a certain network node moment, and then we'll go off and improvise other things, and off it goes. And you know, that is not a place where you have to justify your funding. You might have to up there, as we know, or sell books, or whatever one has to do. But that mycelial connection and strengthening artists between artists is, I feel, really, really key. And a book does that thing. It's not convincing people to change. It is inspiring a very different engagement with the planet and with life, as Lucy's been saying.
So the work we're going to be doing over the next sort of 3 or 4 months is we're not going to rewrite the book, but we're going to replace it. We're going to replace it into a community practice. It's our belief that the practice it describes, it's called in the book Transitional Arts Practice. It's very interesting hearing Lara and Andy what you call this practice, because it had a sort of seed in the beginning of the transition from, if you like, a sort of growth industrial world to a life enhancing one in which life is sustained, and that the practice is one that is, in a sense, in service to life. And whether it's working with clay, whether it's working with children's hospital, whether it's working with soil, whether it's working with rivers and water, whether it's working with the community in different places, that is in essence a sort of very hands-on sense of what the practice is in connecting, building connection, building relationship, building care, building community. So it is our belief that it is valuable to replace the book, but in doing that, it's a requirement to look back at what has happened since 2015, and quite a lot has happened since 2015 if we just sort of go back in time. So just for 10 minutes, if you would just like to kind of chat, you can move if you like to move, or you may be happy sitting where you are. But you may have your own notebook, you may just be brilliant memory people, or sort of repost it there. You may just like to sit quietly yourself and just review, you know, both in terms of kind of external events, Gaian events, political, social, the collective, the communal, yourself. But yourself particularly in terms of your practice, you know, what it is that, how you act, how you do, how you evolve and develop that practice. And that just might be a useful exercise for you. But what I hope is that in the last kind of 10 or 15 minutes of this afternoon, I would love us all to then sort of gravitate through a little bit of mapping. And although we don't work in lines, we have got a line. So yes,
That practical thing, there are quite a number of us around that piece of paper, so it would be better if we put them on
Yes.
post-it notes to put on that.
yes, 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 you can put them on the post-it note, of which I have so many. If you but yeah, I don't know, it might just be an interesting exercise. Nothing is too safe, and nothing is too bright. I can see my yeah. And I've also got hundreds of pens. It's always good to have a conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
Big events. Yes. I mean, I remember the you do anything that we're
So we'll now pause this and come back to you when we start summing up. Thank you for listening.